the quiet of the evening, where shadows softly play, a fairy tale wolf sheds his skin, gently drifting away, with a twinkle in his eye and a heart full of dreams. He waits for the Friday night glow, where the magic redeems. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. He picks up a book, the pages worn and wise, every line a whisper under the vast skies, from far off lands where the wild things roam, to enchanted forests where the heart finds home. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. With every word he reads, he casts a spell of peace, transporting all who listen to a land where joy won't cease. For in these fairy tales, amidst the laughter and tears, the wolf finds his solace, he conquers his fears. As the night grows deeper, he serenades the moon with melodies that linger, a soft and soothing tune.
I hate cutting that song off, but I started a little bit late tonight. I was arguing with the site about flavors. I don't know. No reason for me to have to do that. Notice, we're starting with one cat on the bed. And congrats on getting first, and thank you for the lurk, Salty. But we only have 4 stories left in this book. Then I get to go into the last fairy book. And then I'll have to find other fairy tales to read, I guess. I still think it's funny this is the 19th book I've read. And the 11th one just out of the series. I already have the Arabian Nights book from the same editor, so I could probably read that. That way I just keep in the Andrew Lang series and get all of Lang's done. Then I can branch into other ones. Or I could go into folklore, or I could start reading my own version of the Fairy Cabinet. But, yeah. Let's see, there's pages left in this one. There are only 31 pages left in this book, so it may end up being a short night. Cool. And so you get to see all my commentary on the stories. Because those books are kind of represent the stories I read in my first 5 or 6 dreams. That's why they're, titled as told by the Wolf Storyteller. Because it had to be stories I had told. And I did try to correct some language issues and a few other things in them. I've had to fix a lot of spelling mistakes I found in some of the things, but when I just started typing them out on my own, it was a lot easier than trying to, copy other people's words. I started learning German just so I could help translate those. But I have explanations of some terms that, kids may not know, so I explain them in my blurbs inside the stories, so it'll be interesting. Only 4 stories left of this book. Man. And the first one is Armenian stories, apparently. Pretty much, I've been doing to these fairy tales the same thing that the translators in this series has been doing. It's not the stories as they translated it, but stories somewhat cleaned up for people to understand a little bit easier. I mean, if you... That's it, it's in book 3. Yeah, I did, the children who played at Butcher in the 3rd book, and I literally wrote 2 different endings for it, because I'd found 2 different endings for it when I was doing the translations. One's a lot nicer, and doesn't have nearly the kill count. I do have a death count at the end of book 3, though. I actually got bored and tracked them on how many characters died in that book. Yeah. I think I had it written down in one of my notebooks. Let's see. This one had the notes in. The mods I have in Cyberpunk. Oh, yeah, I do have a death count. Okay. The final death count in Book 3. 9 humans, 15 animals, 5 sausages, 6 inanimate objects, 1 ogre, and then there were dismemberments. 3 dismemberments. 1 was a finger, and the other 2 were removing hands. That's all in book 3. I didn't go back and write them in the other ones. But it's fun to keep track of death counts in fairy tales. I haven't quite reached Disney levels, but still. Anyway, our first story for tonight in this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales. He wins who waits. Once upon a time there reigned a king who had an only daughter. This girl had been spoiled by everyone from her birth, and besides being beautiful, was clever and quite willful. And when she grew old enough to be married, she refused to have anything to say to the prince whom her father favored, but declared that she would choose her own husband. By long experience, the king knew that once she had her mind made up, there was no use expecting her to change it. So he inquired meekly what she wished him to do. Summon all the young men in the kingdom to appear before me a month from today, answered the princess, and the one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband. But, my dear, began the king in tones of dismay. The one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband, repeated the princess in a louder voice than before. And the king understood the signal, and with a sigh proceeded to do her bidding. The young men arrived, tall, short, fair, dark, rich, poor. They stood in rows in the great courtyard in front of the palace, and the princess, clad in robes of green, with a golden veil flowing behind her, passed before them all, holding the apple. Once or twice she stopped and hesitated, but in the end she always passed on, till she came to a youth near the end of the last row. There was nothing specially remarkable about him, the bystanders thought, nothing that was likely to take the girl's fancy. 100 others were handsomer, and all wore finer clothes, but he met the princess's eyes frankly and with a smile, and she smiled too, and held out the apple. There is some mistake, cried the king, who had anxiously watched her progress, and hoped that none of the candidates would please her. It is impossible that she would wish to marry the son of a poor widow who is not a farthing in the world. Tell her I will not hear of it, and that she must go through the rows again and fix upon someone else. And the princess went through the rows a second time and a third time, and on each occasion she gave the apple to the widow's son. Well, marry him if you will, exclaimed the angry king, but at least you shall not stay here. And the princess answered nothing, but threw up her head, and taking the widow's son by the hand, they left the castle. That evening they were married, and after the ceremony went back to the house of the bridegroom's mother, which, in the eyes of the princess, did not look much bigger than a hen-coop. The old woman was not at all pleased when her son entered bringing his bride with him. As if we were not poor enough before, grumbled she. I dare say that some fine lady can do nothing to earn her living. But the princess stroked her arm and said softly, Do not be vexed, dear mother. I am a famous spinner, and I can sit at my wheel all day without breaking a thread. And she kept her word. But in spite of her efforts with all three, they became poorer and poorer, and at the end of 6 months it was agreed that the husband should go to the neighboring town to get work. Here he met a merchant who was about to start a long journey with a train of camels laden with goods of all sorts, and needed a man to help him. The widow's son begged that he would take him as a servant, and to this the merchant assented, giving him a whole year's salary beforehand. The young man returned home with the news, and the next day bid farewell to his mother and his wife, who were very sad at the parting. Do not forget me while you are absent, whispered the princess as she flung her arms around his neck. And as you pass by the well which lies near the city gate, stop and greet the old man you will find sitting there. Kiss his hand, and then ask him what counsel he can give you on your journey. And the youth set out, and when he reached the well where the old man was sitting, he asked the question as his wife had bidden him. Aye, son, replied the old man, you have done well to come to me, and in return remember 3 things. She whom the heart loves is ever the more beautiful. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. And he wins who waits. The young man thanked him and went on his way. Next morning early the caravan set out, and before sunset it had arrived at the first halting place, around some wells where other company of merchants were already encamped. But no rain had fallen for a long while in that rocky country, and both men and beasts were parched with thirst. To be sure, there was another well about half a mile away, where there was always water, but to get to it you had to be lowered deep down, and besides, no one who had ever descended that well had been known to come back. However, until they could store some water in their bags of goatskin, the caravans dared not go further into the desert, and on the night of the arrival of the widow's son and his master, the merchants had decided to offer a large reward to anyone who was brave enough to go down into the enchanted well and bring some up. Thus it happened at sunrise. The young man was aroused from his sleep by a herald making his round of the camp, proclaiming that every merchant present would give 1,000 piastres to the man who would risk his life to bring water for themselves and their camels. The youth hesitated for a little while when he heard of the proclamation. The story of the well had spread far and wide, and long ago had reached his ears. The danger was great, but he knew then, if he should come back alive, he would be the possessor of 80,000 piastres. He turned to the herald who was passing by the tent. He goes, "I will go," he said. "What madness!" cried his master, who happened to be standing near. "You are too young to throw your life away like that. Run after the herald and tell him you take back your offer." But the young man shook his head, and the merchant saw that it was useless to try to persuade him. "Well, it will be your own affair," he observed at last. "If you must go, you must. Only if you return, I will give you a camel's load of goods, and my best mule besides." And touching his turban as a token of farewell, he entered the tent. Hardly had he done so than a crowd of men were seen pouring out of the camp. "How can we thank you?" they exclaimed, pressing around the youth. "Our camels as well as ourselves are almost dead of thirst. See, here's a rope we have brought to let you down." "Well, come then," answered the youth, and they all set out. On reaching the well, the rope was knotted securely under his arms, and a big goatskin bottle was given to him, and he was lowered gently into the bottom of the pit. Here a clear stream was bubbling over rocks, and stooping down, he was about to drink, when a huge Arab appeared before him, saying in a loud voice, "Come with me!" The young man rose, never doubting that this was his last hour, but he could do nothing. So he followed the Arab into a brightly lighted hall on the further side of the little river. There his guide sat down, and drawing towards him two boys, one black and the other white, he said to the stranger, "I have a question to ask you. If you answer right, your life shall be spared. If not, your head will be forfeit, as the head of many others have been before you. Tell me, which of my two children do I think is the handsomer?" The question did not seem like a hard one, for the white boy was beautiful, a child as he ever seen, and the brother was even ugly for a Negro. But just as the youth was going to speak, the old man's counsel flashed into the youth's mind, and he hastily repeated, "The one whom we love best is always the handsomest." "You have saved me!" cried the Arab, rising quickly from his seat and pressing the young man in his arms. "Ah, if you could only guess what I have suffered for the stupidity of all the people who have had put that question, and I was condemned by a wicked genius to remain here until it was answered. But what brought you to this place, and how can I reward you for what you have done for me?" "By helping me draw enough water for my caravan of 80 merchants and their camels, who are dying of want for it," replied the youth. "That is easily done," said the Arab. "Take these 3 apples. When you have filled your skin and are ready to be drawn up, lay one of them on the ground. Halfway to the earth, let another fall, and at the top, drop the third. If you follow my directions, no harm will happen to you. And take, besides, these 3 pomegranates, green, white, and red. One day you will find a use for them." The young man did as he was told, and stepped out on the rocky waste, where the merchants were anxiously awaiting him. Oh, how thirsty they were! But even after the camels had drunk, their skins seemed as full as ever. Full of gratitude for their deliverance, the merchants pressed the money into his hands, while his own master bade him choose what goods he liked, and a mule to carry them. Welcome and guilty. So the widow's son was rich at last, and when the merchant had sold his merchandise and returned home to his native city, his servant hired a man by whom he sent the money and mule back to his wife. I will send the pomegranates also, thought he, for if I leave them in my turban, they may fall out. And he drew them out of his turban, but the fruit had vanished, and in their places were three precious stones, green, white, and red. For a long time he remained with the merchant, who gradually trusted him with all his business, and gave him a large share of the money he made. When his master died, the young man wished to return home, but the widow begged him to stay and help her. And one day he awoke with a start, to remember that 20 years had passed since he had gone away. "I want to see my wife," he said the next morning to his mistress. "If at any time I can be of use to you, send a messenger to me. Meanwhile, I've told his son what to do." And mounting a camel, he set off. And stretch and hydrate. Oh, really made that stuff do better. Now, soon after he had taken service with the merchant, a little boy had been born to him, and both the princess and the old woman toiled hard all day to get the baby food and clothing. When the money and the pomegranates arrived, there was no need for them to work any more, and the princess saw at once that they were not fruit at all, but precious stones of great value. The old woman, however, not being accustomed, like her daughter-in-law, to the sight of jewels, only took them for common fruit, and wished to give them to the child to eat. She was very angry when the princess hastily took them from her and hid them in her sleeve, while she went to market and bought the three finest pomegranates she could find, which she handed the old woman for the little boy. Then she bought beautiful new clothes for all of them. And when they were dressed, they looked as fine as could be. Next, she took out one of the precious stones which her husband had sent her, and placed it in a small silver box. This she wrapped up in a handkerchief embroidered with gold, and filled the old woman's pockets with gold and silver pieces. "Go, dear mother," she said, "to the palace and present the jewel to the king, and if he asks you what he can give you in return, tell him you want a paper, with his seal attached, proclaiming that no one is to meddle with anything you may choose to do. Before you leave the palace, distribute the money amongst the servants." The old woman took the box and started for the palace. No one there had ever seen a ruby of such beauty, and the famous jeweler in town was summoned to declare its value. But all he could say was, "If a boy threw the stone into the air with all his might, and you could pile up gold as high as the flight of the stone, it would not be sufficient to pay for this ruby." At these words, the king's face fell. Having once seen a ruby, he could not bear to part with it, yet all the money in his treasury would not be enough to buy it. So for a little while he remained silent, wondering what offer he could make the old woman. And at last he said, "I cannot give you its worth in money. Is there anything you will take in exchange?" "A paper signed by your hand and sealed with your seal, proclaiming that I may do what I will, without let or hindrance," answered she promptly. And the king, delighted to have obtained what he had coveted at so small a cost, gave her the paper without delay. Then the old woman took her leave and returned home. The fame of this wonderful ruby soon spread far and wide, and envoys arrived at the little house to know if there were more stones to sell. Each king was so anxious to gain possession of a treasure that he bade his messenger outbid all the rest. And so the princess sold the two remaining stones for a sum of money so large that if the gold pieces had been spread out, they would have reached from here to the moon. The first thing she did was to build a palace by the side of the cottage, and it was raised on gold pillars, in which were set great diamonds, which blazed night and day. Of course, the news of this palace was the first thing that reached the king, her father, on his return from the wars, and he hurried to see it. In the doorway stood a young man of 20 who was his grandson, though neither of them knew it. And so pleased was the king with the appearance of the youth that he carried him back to his own palace and made him commander of the whole army. Not long after this, the widow's son returned to his native land. There, sure enough, was a tiny cottage where he had lived with his mother, but the gorgeous building beside it was quite new to him. What had become of his wife and his mother, and who could be dwelling in that other wonderful place? There were first thoughts that flashed through his mind, but not wishing to betray himself by asking any passing strangers, he climbed up into a tree that stood opposite the palace and just watched. By and by a lady came out and began to gather some of the roses and jessamine that hung on the porch. 20 years that had passed since he had last beheld her vanished in an instant, and he knew her to be his own wife, almost looking as young and beautiful as the day of their parting. He was about to jump down from the tree and hasten to her side when she was joined by a young man who placed his arm affectionately around her neck. Oh, at the sight, the angry husband drew his bow, but before he could let fly the arrow, the counsel of the wise men came back to him. "Patience is the first step on the road to happiness." And he laid it down again. At this moment the princess turned, and drawing her companion's head down to hers, kissed him on each cheek. For the second time blind rage filled the heart of the watcher, and he snatched up his bow from the branch where it hung, when words heard long since seemed to sound in his ears. "He wins who waits." And the bow dropped to his side. Then through the silent air came the sound of the youth's voice. "Mother, can you tell me nothing about father? Does he still live, and will he never return to us?" "Alas, my son, how can I answer you?" replied the lady. 20 years have passed since he left us to make his fortune, and that time only once have I heard aught from him. But what has brought it to your mind now?" "Hey, Matsu." "Because last night I dreamed that he was here," said the youth, "and then I remembered what I've long forgotten, that I had a father, even though his very history is strange to me. Now tell me, I pray you, all you can concerning him." And standing under the jessamine, the son learnt his father's history, and the man in the tree listened also. "Oh," exclaimed the youth when it ended, while he twisted his hands in pain, "I am General-in-Chief, and you are the king's daughter, and we have the most splendid palace in the whole world. And my father lives we know not where, and for all we can guess may be poor and miserable. Tomorrow I'll ask the king to give me soldiers, and I will seek him out in the whole earth until I find him." Then the man came down from the tree, and clasped his wife and son in his arms. All that night they talked, and when the sun rose, it found them still talking. But as soon as it was proper, he went to the palace to pay his homage to the king, and to inform him of all that had happened, and who they really were. The king was overjoyed to think that his daughter, whom he had long since forgotten and sorely missed, was living at his gates, and was, besides, the mother of the youth who was so dear to him. "It was written beforehand," cried the monarch. "You are my son-in-law before the world, and shall be king after me." And the man bowed his head. He had waited, and he had won. Yay! Welcome in, Matsu. I'd say if you're not already following Matsu, he tells stories and plays games too. And his library might be almost as oddly complex as mine is sometimes. But at least He's got a lot of hands, or tentacles, to help. Me, I just have this fluffy thing down in the camera. But yeah. And Matsu, you don't have to feel about all the ejaculating in your stream yesterday, because I had an entire chapter that was concerning Cowboy Dick. That's an Darth Parm will reassure you that. Yeah. Anyway, so this is why the stories are edited out of the stream, so I can do the random streams with weird awkwardness. Yes, everyone at the ranch did like Cowboy Dick. So you can watch my stream from yesterday, or I'll try to get the stories and everything edited over the weekend, so I'll have them posted on the channel. But I think that one chapter had me saying Cowboy Dick at least 20 times. And it was really just in that one chapter. But anyway, leaving Cowboy Dick behind us, our next story for this fabulous Friday Night of Fairy Tales. Yeah, Cowboy Dick was not a dick, he was a good guy. See, he left the story as he came in. Stiff. Anyway, next story. The Steel Cane. Once upon a time there lived an old woman who had a small cottage on the edge of the forest. Behind the cottage was a garden, which all sorts of vegetables grew, and beyond that, a field with 2 or 3 cows in it, so her neighbors considered her quite rich, and envied her greatly. As long as she was strong enough to work all day in her garden, the old woman never felt lonely. But after a while she had a bad illness, which left her much weaker than before, and she began to think that now and then it would be nice to just have someone to speak to. Just at this moment she heard of the death of the shepherd and his wife, who dwelt on the other side of the plain, leaving a little boy quite alone in the world. "That suits me just fine," she said, and she sent a man over to bring the child, whom she intended to adopt for her own. Now, the boy, who was about 12 years old, ought to have considered himself very lucky, for his new mother was kind to him, and as kind as the old one. But unfortunately, he made friends with some bad, rude companions whose tricks caused him to be a terror to everyone, and the poor old woman never ceased in regretting her lost solitude. Things went this way for some years, till the boy became a man. Perhaps if he were to be married, he might sober down, she thought to herself, and she inquired among her neighbors what girls there were of age to choose from. At length she found one, good and industrious, as well as pretty, and as the young man raised no objections, the wedding took place at once, and the bride and bridegroom went to live in the cottage with the old woman. No change was to be seen in the husband's conduct. All day long he was out amusing himself in the company of his former friends, and if his wife dared to say anything to him on his return, he beat her with his stick. And next year, when the baby was born to them, he beat it also. At length the old woman's patience was worn out. She saw that it was quite useless to expect the lazy, idle creature to mend his ways, and one day she said to him, "Do you mean to go on like this forever? Remember, you are no longer a boy, but it is time that you left off behaving like one. Come, shake off your bad habits, and work for your wife and child, and above all, stop beating them. If not, I will transform you into an ass, and heavy loads shall be piled on your back, and the men shall ride you. Briars shall be your food, and goat shall prick you. And in your turn you shall know what it feels like to be beaten." But if she expected her words to do any good, she soon found out her mistake, for the young man only grew angry and rudely cried out, "Bah, hold your tongue, or I will whip you also." "Will you?" she answered grimly, and swift as lightning she picked up a steel cane that stood in the corner and laid it across his shoulders. In an instant his ears had grown long, and his face longer. His arms had become legs, and his body was covered with close gray hair. Truly he was an ass, and a very ugly one, too. "Leave the house!" commanded the old woman, and shambling awkwardly, the man passed by. "Oh, my fine fellow, you're exactly what I was looking for. You don't seem to have a master, so—" Oh, well, this is a different person. Yeah, the auto mod actually tried to prevent that. I allow it because I love that kind of thing. As he was standing in the path outside, not knowing what to do, a man passed by. "Oh, my fine fellow, you are exactly what I was looking for. You don't seem to have a master, so come with me. I will find something for you to do." And taking him by the ear, he led him from the cottage. For 7 years, the ass led a hard life, just as the old woman had foretold. But instead of remembering that he had brought this all on himself, and being sorry for his evil ways, he grew harder and more bitter. At the end of 7 years, his ass skin wore out, and he became a man again, and one day returned to the cottage. His wife opened the door in answer to his knock. Then, letting fall the latch, she ran inside, crying, "Grandmother, grandmother, your son has come back." "I thought he would," replied the old woman, going on with her spinning. "Well, what we have... Well, we could have done very well without him, but as he is here, I suppose he must come in." And come in he did, but as the old woman expected, he behaved still worse than before. For some weeks she allowed him to do what he liked, and at last she said, "So, experience has taught you nothing. After all, there are very few people who have sense to learn by it. But take care lest I change you into a wolf, to be prey for dogs and men." And it took 7 years for his ass skin to wear out. "You talk too much. Shall I break your head for you?" was all the answer she got. Had the young man looked at her face, he might have taken warning, but he was busy making a pipe and took no notice. The next moment, the steel cane had touched his shoulders, and a big gray wolf bounded out through the door. Oh, what a yapping among the dogs, and what a shouting among the neighbors as they gave chase! For 7 years he had to live the life of a hunted animal, often cold and nearly always hungry, never daring to allow himself a sound sleep. At the end of that time his wolfskin wore out also, and again he appeared at the cottage door. But the second 7 years had taught him no more than the first. His conduct was worse than before, and one day he beat his wife and son so brutally that they screamed to the old woman to come to their aid. She did, and brought her steel cane with her. In a second, the ruffian had vanished. A big black crow was flying across the room, crying, "Yar! Yar!" The window was open, and he darted through it. And seeking his companions who had ruined him, he managed to make them understand what had happened. "We will avenge you," they said, and taking up a rope, set out to strangle the old woman. But she was ready for them. One stroke of her cane, and they were all changed into a troop of black crows. And this time, their feathers are lasting still. Okay. Skin is temporary, feathers are forever. Dang. I've only gotten 40 minutes in so far. It's 2 stories down, I've only got 2 left. It may very likely be a short stream. Gonna have to start tracking down the rest of Lang's books. Now, the one this one mentioned at the very beginning really intrigues me. I want to find Le Cabinet de Fies. The fairy cabinet. Because then I would actually have books that Ling got stories from. And then I'd be unstoppable. Anyway, our next story for this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales: The Punishment of Fairy Gangana. I say Gangana, and I think Dandadan. No. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who ruled over a country so small that you could easily walk around it in one day. They were both very good, simple people. Not very wise, perhaps, but anxious to be kind to everyone. And this was often a mistake, for the king allowed all his subjects to talk at once, and offer advice upon the government of the kingdom as well as upon private matters. And at the end of it all was that it was very difficult to get any laws made, and still more, to get anyone to actually obey them. Hey, Corey. Now, no traveler ever passed through the kingdom without inquiring how it came to be so small. And this was the reason, as soon as Petaldo, for that was the king's name, had been born, his father and mother betrothed him to the niece of their friend, the fair Gangana, if she would ever have one. But as the years passed on, and Gangana was still without a niece, the young prince forgot all about his destined bride, and when he was 25, he secretly married the beautiful daughter of a rich farmer with whom he had fallen violently in love. When the fairy heard the news, she fell into a violent rage, and hurried off to tell the king. The old man thought in his heart that his son had waited so long, and he did not dare say so, lest some dreadful spell might be thrown over them all, and they should be changed into birds or snakes, and worst of all, or into stones. So much against his will, he was obliged to disinherit the young man, and to forbid him to come to court. Indeed, he would have been a beggar had it not been the property of his wife, and given her by the farmer, with the use obtained permission to erect into a kingdom. Most princes would have been very angry at this treatment, especially as the old king soon died, and the queen was delighted to reign in his place. But Petaldo was a contented young man, and was quite satisfied with arranging his tiny court on the model of his father's, and having a lord chamberlain and high steward and several gentlemen in attendance, while the young queen appointed her own ladies-in-waiting and maids of honor. He likewise set up a mint to coin money, and chose as sessional of his head and 5 policemen who kept order in the capital and punished the boys who were caught in the act of throwing stones at the palace windows. The first to fill the important office was young King's father-in-law, an excellent man by the name of Kabosh. He was very beloved by everyone, and so sensible that he was not at all in vain in raising one of the dignity of seneschal, when he had only been a common farmer, but went out to his fields every day as usual. This conduct so struck his king that very soon he never did anything without consulting him. Every morning Kabosh and his son-in-law had breakfast together, and when they had finished, the king took out his iron chests great bundles of state papers, which he desired to talk over with his seneschal. Sometimes they would spend 2 hours at least in deciding these important matters, but more often, after a few minutes, Kabosh would say, "Excuse me, sire, but your Majesty does not understand this affair in the least. Leave it to me. I will settle it." "But what am I to do then?" asked the king, and his minister answered, "Oh, you can rule your wife and see after your fruit garden. You will find that those two things will take up all your time." "Oh, perhaps you're right," replied the king, secretly glad to be rid of the cares of government. But though Kabosh did all the work, the Toldo never failed to appear on grand occasions, in his royal mantle of red linen, holding a scepter of gilded wood. Meanwhile, he passed his mornings in studying books from which he learned the proper seasons to plant his fruit trees, and when they should be pruned, and his afternoons in the garden, where he put his knowledge into practice. In the evening he played cards with his father-in-law, and supped in public with the queen, and by 10 o'clock everybody in the palace was fast asleep. The queen, on her side, was quite happy as her husband. She loved to be in her dairy, and nobody in the kingdom could make such delicious cheeses. But however busy she might be, she never forgot to bake a little barley cake, and make a tiny cream cheese, and put them under the particular rose tree in the garden. If you asked her whom they were for, and where they went, she could not have told you, but would have said that on the night of her marriage a fairy had appeared to her in a dream, and had bidden her to perform this ceremony. After the king and the queen had 6 children, a little boy was born, with a small red cap on his head, and he was quite different from his brothers and sisters, and his parents loved Ketchum better than any of them. The years went on, and the children were growing big, and one day after Gillette, the queen, had finished baking her cake and had turned it on a plate, and a lovely blue mouse crept up the leg of the table and ran to the plate. Instead of chasing it away, as most women would have done, the queen pretended not to notice what the mouse was doing, and was very much surprised to see the little creature pick up the cake and carry it off to the chimney. She sprang forwards to stop it when suddenly the mouse and the cake vanished, and in their place stood an old woman, only a foot high, whose clothes hung in rags around her. Taking up a sharp-pointed iron stick, she drew on the earthen floor some strange signs, uttering 7 cries as she did so, and murmuring something in a low voice, amongst which the queen was quite sure she caught the words, "Faith, wisdom, happiness." Then, seizing the kitchen broom, she whirled it 3 times around her head and vanished. Immediately there arose a great noise in the next room, and opening the door, the queen beheld 3 large cockchafers, each one with a princess between its feet, while the princess were seated on the backs of 3 swallows. In the middle was a car formed of a pink shell and drawn by 2 robin redbreasts, and in this car Ketchum was sitting, by the side of a blue mouse, who was dressed in a splendid mantle of black velvet fastened under his chin. Before the queen had recovered from her surprise, the cockchafers, redbreasts, and mouse and children had all flown, singing, to the window, and disappeared from view. The loud shrieks of the queen brought her husband and father running to the room, and when they at last made out from her broken sentences what had really happened, they hastily snatched up some stout sticks that were lying and set off to the rescue, one going in one direction and one in the other. For at least an hour the queen sat sobbing where they had left her, when at last she was roused by a piece of folded paper falling from her feet. She stooped and picked it up eagerly. hoping that it might contain some news of her lost children. It was very short, but when she had read a few words, Gillette was informed, for it bade her to take heart, that they were well and happy and under the protection of a fairy. "On your own faith and prudence depends your happiness," ended the writer. "It is I who have seen all these years eaten the food you placed under the rose tree, and some day I shall reward you for it. Everything comes to he who knows how to wait," is the advice given by the Fairy of the Fields. Then the queen rose up and bathed her face and combed her shining hair, and she turned away from her mirror. She beheld linnets sitting on her bed. No one would have known that it was anything but a common linnet, and yesterday the queen would have thought so too. But this morning so many wonderful things had happened that she did not doubt for a minute that the writer of the letter was before her. "Pretty linnet," she said, "I will try to do all you wish. Only give me, I pray you, now and then. Here's for my little catcher-drum." The linnet flapped her wings and sang, and flew away. So the queen knew that she had guessed rightly, and thanked her in her heart. By and by the king and the sentinel returned, hungry and tired from their fruitless search. They were amazed and rather angry to find the queen, whom they had left weeping, quite cheerful. Could she really care for her children so little and have forgotten them so soon? What could have caused this change? But to all their questions, Gillette would only answer, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." "That is true," replied her father, "and after all, your majesty must remember that the revenues of your kingdom could hardly bear the cost of 7 princes and princesses brought up according to their rank. Be grateful, then, to those who have relieved you of your burden." "You're right, you're always right," cried the king, whose face once more beamed with smiles, and life at the palace went on as before, till Pedalto received a piece of news which disturbed him greatly. The queen, his mother, who had for some time been a widow, suddenly made up her mind to marry again, and her choice had fallen on the young king of the Green Isles, who was younger than her own son, and besides handsome and fond of pleasure, which Pedalto was not. Now, the grandmother, foolish though she was in many respects, had the sense to see that a woman as old and as plain as she could hardly expect a young man to fall in love with her, and that, if this was to happen, it would be needful to find some spell which would bring her back her youth and beauty. Of course, the fairy Gangana could have wrought the change with one wave of her wand, but unluckily the two were no longer friends, because the fairy had tried hard to persuade the queen to declare her niece heiress to the crown, which the queen refused to do. Naturally, therefore, it was no use asking the help of Gangana to enable the queen to take a second husband, who would be certain to succeed her, and messengers were sent all over the neighboring kingdoms, seeking to find a witch or a fairy who would work the wished-for miracle. None, however, could be found with sufficient skill, and at length the queen saw that if ever the king of the Green Islands was to be her husband, she must throw herself upon the mercy of the fairy Gangana. The fairy's wrath was great when she heard the queen's story, but she knew that very well. As the king of the Green Isles was spent all his money, he would probably be ready to marry even an old woman like her friend, in order to get more. So in order to gain time, she hid her feelings, and told the queen that in 3 days the spell would be accomplished. Her words made the queen so happy that 20 years seemed to fall from her at once, and she counted not only the hours, but the minutes to the appointed time. It came at last, and the fairy stood before her in a long robe of pink and silver, held up by a tiny round dwarf, who carried a small box under his arm. The queen received her with all the marks of respect that she could think of, and at the request of Gangana, ordered the doors and the windows of the great hall to be closed, and her attendants to retire, so that she and her guest might be quite alone. Then, opening the box which was presented to her on one knee by the dwarf, The fairy took from it a small vellum book with silver clasps, a wand that lengthened out as it touched it, and a crystal bottle filled with very clear green water. She next bade the queen to sit on the seat in the middle of the room, and the dwarf to stand opposite her, after which she stooped down and drew 3 circles on the ground with the golden rod, touched each of them thrice with her wand, and sprinkled the liquid over both. Gradually, the queen's big features began to grow smaller, and her face fresher, while at the same time the dwarf became about twice as tall as he had been before. This sight, added to the blue flames which sprang up from the 3 circles, so frightened the queen that she fainted in the chair. And when she recovered, both the page and the fairy had vanished. At first she felt vaguely puzzled, not remembering clearly what had happened. Then it all came back to her, and she jumped as she ran to the nearest mirror. Oh, how happy she was! And jumping up to ran... Oh, how happy she was! Her long nose and her pointed teeth had become things of beauty. Her hair was thick and curly and bright gold. The fairy had indeed fulfilled her promise. But in her hurry and pleasure, the queen never noticed that she was not been changed into a beautiful lady, but into a very tall little girl of 8 or 9 years old. Instead of her magnificent velvet dress, edged with fur and embroidered with gold, she wore a straight muslin frock with a little lace apron, while her hair, which had always been combed and twisted and fastened with diamond pins, hung in curls down her back. But if she had only known, something besides this had befallen her, for except her regards of love for the King of the Green Isles, her mind, as well as her face, had become that of a child, and this her courtiers were aware of, if she was not. Of course, they could not imagine what had occurred, and did not know how to behave themselves, till the chief minister set an example by ordering his wife and daughters to copy the queen's clothes, in a way of speaking. Then in a short time the whole court, including the men, talked and dressed like children, and played with dolls or little tin soldiers, while at the state dinners nothing was seen but iced fruits or sweet cakes made in the shape of birds and horses. But whatever she might be doing, the queen hardly ceased talking about the King of the Green Isles, whom she always spoke of as my little husband, and as weeks passed on, and he did not come, she began to get very cross and impatient, so that her courtiers kept away from her as much as they could. By the time, too, they were growing tired of pretending to be children, and whispered their intention of leaving the palace and taking service under a neighboring sovereign, when one day a loud blast of trumpets announced the arrival of the long-expected guest. In an instant, all was smiles again, and in spite of the strictest rules of court etiquette, the queen insisted on receiving her young king at the bottom of the stairs. Unfortunately, in her haste, she fell over her dress and rolled down several steps, screaming like a child from fright. She was not really hurt, though she scratched her nose and bruised her forehead. She was obliged to be carried to her room and have her face bathed in cold water. Still, in spite of this, she gave strict orders that the king should be brought to her presence the moment he entered the palace. A shrill blast outside her door sent a twinge of pain through the queen's head, which by this time was aching badly, but in her joy at the welcome of her future husband she paid no heed to it. Between 2 lines of courtiers, bowing low, the young king advanced quickly, but at the sight of the queen and her bandages, broke into such violent fits of laughter that he was forced to leave the room, and even the palace. When the queen had recovered from the vexation caused by the king's rude behavior, she bade her attendants to hasten after him and fetch him back, but no promises or entreaties would persuade him to return. This, of course, made the queen's temper even worse than it was before, and a plot was set on foot to deprive her of the crown, which would certainly have succeeded had not the fairy Gangana, who had only wished to prevent her marriage, restored her to her proper shape. But far from thanking her friend for the service, the sight of her old face in the mirror filled her with despair, and from that day she hated Gangana with a deadly hatred. And where are Prince Bataldo's children all this while? Why, in the island of Bambini, where they had playfellows to their heart's content and plenty of fairies to take care of them. But out of all the 7 princes and princesses whom the queen had seen carried off through the window, there was only Catchian who was good and obedient. The other 6 were so rude and quarrelsome that they could get no one to play with them, and at last, as a punishment, the fairy changed them all into marionettes, till they should learn to behave better. Now, in an unlucky moment, the Fair of the Fields determined to visit her friend the Queen of the Fairies, who lived in a distant island, in order to consult her as what was to become of Ketchum. She was entering the Hall of Audience. Gangana was leaving it, with sharp words were exchanged between them. After her enemy had flown off in a rage, the Fair of the Fields poured out her whole story of Gangana's wickedness to the Queen, and implored her counsel. "Be comforted," answered the Fairy Queen. "For a while she must work her will, and at this moment she is carrying off Ketchin to the island where she still holds her niece captive. But it should make an evil use of the power she has. Her punishment will be swift and great. And now I will give you this precious vial. Guard it carefully, for the liquid it contains will cause you to become invisible and safe from the piercing eyes of all fairies. Against the eyes of mortals, it has no charm." With a heart somewhat lighter, the Fair of the Fields returned to her own island, and the better to protect the 6 new marionettes from the wicked fairy, she sprinkled them with a few drops of the liquid, only avoiding just the tips of their toes, so that she might be able to know where they were again. Then she set off to the kingdom of Petaldo, which she found in a state of revolt, because for the first time since he ascended to the throne he had declared to impose a tax. Indeed, matters might have ended in a war, or in the cutting off of the king's head, had the fairy not discovered a means by contenting everybody, and of whispering in each to the queen that all was well with her children, for she dared not tell her of the loss of Catechin. And what had become of Catechin? Well, the Fairy of the Fields had found out, by means of her books which had told her, that the poor little boy had been placed by Gangana on an enchanted island, round which flowed a rapid river, sweeping rocks and trees in its current. Besides the river, the island was guarded by 24 enormous dragons, breathing flames and forming a rampart of fire, which it seemed as if none could pass. The Fairy of the Fields knew all this, but she had a brave heart, and determined that by some means or other she would overcome all obstacles and rescue Catechin from the power of Gangana. So, taking with her the water of invisibility, she sprinkled it over her, and mounting her favorite winged lizard, set out for the island. When it appeared in sight, she wrapped herself in a fireproof mantle, then, bidding the lizard return home, she slipped past the dragons and entered the island. Scarcely had she done so than she beheld Gangana approaching her, talking loudly and angrily to a genius who flew by her side. From what she had said, the fairy learned that Petaldo's mother, the old queen, had died from rage on hearing the marriage of the king to the Green Island to a young and lovely bride, instead of leaving her kingdom to Gangana, who had bequeathed it to one of her children, and the son of Petaldo. "But all the trouble I've gone through with that foolish old woman shall be for nothing," cried Gangana. "Go at once to my stables and fetch out the strongest and swiftest griffins you can find in the stalls, and harness them to the yellow coach. Drive this with all the speed you may to the Isle of Bambini, and carry off the 6 children of Petaldo that are still there. I will see to Petaldo and Gillette myself. When I've got them all safe here, I will change the parents into rabbits and the children into dogs. As for Catechin, I have not quite made up my mind what I shall do with him." The Fair of the Fields did not wait to hear more. No time was to be lost in seeking the help of the Fairy Queen if Petaldo and his family were being saved from this dreadful doom. So without warning to summon her lizard, she flew across the island and past the dangerous dragons till her feet once more touched the ground again. But at that instant a black cloud rolled over her, and loud thunder rent the air, and the earth rocked beneath her. Then wild lightnings lit up the sky, and by the flashes she saw the 24 dragons fighting together, uttering shrieks and yells, till the whole earth must have heard the uproar. Trembling in terror, the fairies stood rooted to the spot, and when day broke, island, torrent, and dragons had all vanished, and in their stead was barren rock. On the summit of the rock stood a black ostrich, and on its back were seated Catachin and the little niece of the fairy Gangana, for whose sake she had committed so many evil deeds. While the Fairy of the Fields was gazing in surprise at this strange sight, the ostrich spread its wings and flew off in the direction of the Fortunate Isle, and, followed unseen by the good fairy, entered the great hall where the queen was sitting on her throne. Proud and exultant was Gangana in her new shape, for, by all the laws of fairydom, if she succeeded in laying Catachin at her feet of the queen, and received him back from her, he was in her power for life, and she might do with him as she would. This the good fairy knew well, and pressed on with all her strength, for the dreadful events of the night had almost exhausted her. But with a mighty effort she snatched up the children away from the back of the ostrich and placed them on the lap of the queen. With a scream of baffled rage, the ostrich turned away, and Gangana stood in her place, waiting for the doom which she had brought upon herself. "You have neglected all my warnings," said the queen, speaking more sternly than any fairy had ever heard before. "And my sentence to that during 200 years you will lose all your privileges as a fairy, and under the form of an ostrich shall become the slave of the lowest and wickedest of the genii whom you have made your friends. As for the children, I shall keep them with me, and they shall be brought up at my court." And so they were, until they grew up and were old enough to be married. Then the Fairy of the Fields took them back to the kingdom of the old queen, where Potoldo was now reigning. But the cares of state proved too heavy for both him and Gillette, after a quiet life had been led for so many years, and they rejoiced to be able to lay aside their crowns and place them on the heads of Catachin and his bride, who was as good as she was beautiful, though she was the niece of the wicked Gangana. And so well had Catachin learned the lessons taught to him at the court of the Fairy Queen, that never since a kingdom was a kingdom had the people been so well governed or so happy. And they went about the streets and fields smiling with joy at the difference between the old times and the new, whispering softly to each other, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." And ads come to those who may not realize I paused them twice to finish that story. Ouch. So, now I will let them happen. And I will see you in a few. Welcome back. I took a little bit longer break than I probably needed to, but look at that cat. Look at her. She's adorable. I don't know why she's the only one who's been showing up on the bed lately. And why she kicks the actual bed out of the way and curls up snugly in the corner. Ooh, excuse me. That's what happens when I chug coffee during a break. But I'd mentioned at the beginning of the stream that this book only had 4 stories left. Well, now it only has 1 story left. So this will be a very short stream. And I was thinking what I could do next week. And I could go ahead and read the last of the fairy books. Or I could slip in a fairy tale that Andrew Lang actually wrote. Now, I don't know if you know about this book or not, but I have Prince Prigio. I somehow managed to acquire a copy. Let's see, when was this one printed? Let's see. No, it was originally done in 1901. This is a Thomas Y. Crow and Company Publishers. I guess this is possibly an original print since it only has the 1 copyright date listed on it. Copyright 1901 by Thomas Y. Crowell and Company. It's in, I would say, aged library condition. Except it was not in the library because it has no markings for library. It does look like someone... No, that's not taped together. That's the original printing on it. But yeah, I may read this next week. Just sneaking in there. Well, maybe a couple of days because it's actually a chapter fairy tale. Let's see how many chapters left. Yeah, this is 18 chapters long. I don't know if I want to slip it in before the last fairy book or do it after the last fairy book. I put up a poll, but my polls never seem to get any attention. This book is... how many pages long is it? I'd be half tempted to scan the pages on this one just so everyone else can see it. Okay, it's 106 pages. But it's maybe a 6x8 book with inch-wide margins, so it's not really much per page. But each chapter looks like it's some little story, which really makes me think about how I'm writing my lore book, because each chapter of that kind of has some story mention. I may hold off before reading this one. Yeah. I will wait until after the last fairy book to read that one. I also have another book edited by Lang. It was Little Red Riding Hood and Other Stories. I'll have to figure out where that is in my library. But it's also a very old copy, and the cover is trying to fall off that one. But, everyone should know by now that I like old books, and I cannot lie. No other papers can deny. But, as I said, we only have one more story of the Olive Fairy book. And then Series 19 will be over. And on to Series 20. Damn, I've read a lot of fairy tales. So let's see, this is my 4th year of streaming, 3rd year as an affiliate. This is the 19th book of folk and fairy tales that I've read. Yeah, I've covered a lot of pages. It would be epic if I could memorize all of these. But I'm not sure if I have that much of a memory. But I can listen to my streams and recognize immediately which story it is when I'm narrating. So I might know the stories by now. Anyway, our last story for the night, and our last story for the Olive Fairy book. The Silent Princess. Once upon a time there lived in Turkey a pasha who had only one son, and so dearly did love this boy that he let him spend the whole day amusing himself, instead of learning how to be useful like his friends. Now the boy's favorite toy was a golden ball, and with this he would play all morning till night without troubling anybody. One day, as he was sitting in the summer house in the garden, making his ball run along the walls and catching it again, he noticed an old woman with an earthen pitcher come to draw water from a well which stood in the corner of the garden. In a moment he had caught his ball and flung it straight at the pitcher, which fell to the ground into 1,000 pieces. The old woman started in surprise, but said nothing, only turned around to fetch another pitcher, and as soon as she disappeared, the boy hurried out to pick up his ball. Scarcely was he back in the summer house when he beheld the old woman a second time approaching the well with the pitcher on her shoulder. She had just taken hold of the handle to lower it into the water, when crash! The pitcher lay in fragments at her feet. Of course, she felt very angry, but for fear of the pasha she still held her peace, and spent her last pence in buying a fresh pitcher. But when this was also broken by a blow from the ball, her wrath burst forth, and she was shaking her fist towards the summer house where the boy was hiding, and she cried, "I wish you may be punished for falling in love with a silent princess!" I want to try that again, because that was fun. "I wish you may be punished by falling in love with a silent princess!" And having said this, she vanished. For some time the boy paid no heed to her words. Instead, he forgot them altogether. But as years went by, and he began to think more about things, the remembrance of the old woman's wish came back to his mind. Who is the silent princess? And why should it be a punishment to fall in love with her? He asked himself, and received no answer. However, that did not prevent him from putting the question again and again, till at length he grew so weak and ill that he could not eat anything, and in the end was forced to lie in bed altogether. His father, the Pasha, became so frightened by this strange disease that he sent for every physician in the kingdom to come to cure him, but no one was able to find a remedy. "How did your illness first begin, my son?" asked the Pasha one day. "Perhaps, if we knew that, we should all know better what to do for you." Then the youth told him what had happened all those years before, when he was a little boy, and what the woman had said to him. "Give me, I pray to you," when his tale was finished, "give me, I pray you, leave to go into the world to search for the princess, and perhaps this evil state may cease." And, sore though his heart was to part from his only son, the Pasha felt that the young man would certainly die if he remained at home any longer. "Go, and peace be with you," he answered, and went out to call his trusted steward, whom he ordered to accompany his young master. Their preparations were soon made, and early one morning the two set out. But neither old man nor young had the slightest idea where they were going, or what they were undertaking. First they lost their way in a dense forest, and from that they at length emerged into a wilderness, where they were wandering for 6 months, not seeing a living creature and scarcely finding anything to eat or drink, till they became nothing but skin and bone, while their garments hung in tatters about them. They had forgotten all about the princess, and their only wish was to find themselves back in the palace again, when one day they discovered that they were standing on the shoulder of a mountain. The stones beneath them shone as brightly as diamonds, and both their hearts beat with joy at beholding a tiny old man approaching them. The sight awoke all manner of recollections, and the numb feeling that had been taken possession of them was away, as if by magic. And it was with glad voices that they greeted the newcomer. "We're here, my friend!" shouted they, and the old man told them that this mountain was where the Sultan's daughter sat, covered by 7 veils, and the shining of the stones was the only reflection of her own brilliance. On hearing this news, all the dangers and difficulties of their past wandering vanished from their minds. "How can we reach her soonest?" asked the youth eagerly. But the old man only answered, "Have patience, my son, yet a while. Another 6 months go before you arrive at the palace where she dwells with the rest of the women. And even so, think well when you can. And should you fail to make her speak, you will have to pay forfeit with your life, as others have done. So beware." Sorry about that disconnect. For some reason, my internet is being a pain in the butt. And there's a little putty in chat for those paying attention. Imagine that, my session's on cable. I am recording, so I'll still have the full stream if you want to watch it. But the prince only laughed at this counsel, as others had also done. After 3 months they found themselves on the top of another mountain, and the prince saw with surprise that its sides were colored a beautiful red. Perched on some cliffs, not far off, was a small village, and the prince proposed to his friend that they should go and rest there. The villagers, on their part, welcomed them gladly, and gave them food to eat and beds to sleep on, and were thankful indeed to have 2 travelers to repose their weary limbs. The next morning they asked their host if he could tell them whether they were still many days' journey from the princess, and whether he knew why the mountains were so much redder than the other mountains. "For 3.5 more months you must still pursue your way," answered he, and by that time you will find yourselves at the gates of the princess's palace. As for the coloration of the mountain, that comes from the soft hue of her cheeks and mouth, which shines through the 7 veils which cover her. But none have ever beheld her face, for she sits there, uttering no word, though one hears whispers of many having lost their lives for her sake. The prince, however, would listen no further, and thanking the man for his kindness, jumped up, and with the steward set out to climb the mountain. On and on they went, sleeping under the trees or in caves, and living upon berries or any fish they could catch in the rivers. But at length, when their clothes were nearly in rags, and their legs so tired that they could hardly walk any further, they saw on top of the next mountain a palace of yellow marble. "There it is, at last!" cried the prince. The blood fresh seemed to spring in his veins. But as he and his companion began to climb towards the top, they paused in horror, for the ground was white with dead men's skulls. It was the prince who recovered his voice, and he said to his friend, as careless as he could, "These must be the skulls of the men who tried to make the princess speak and failed. Well, if we fail too, our bones will strew the ground likewise." "Oh, turn back now, my prince, while there is still time," entreated his companion. "Your father gave you into my charge, but when we set out, I did not know that certain death lay before us." "Take heart, Olalla, take heart," answered the prince. "A man can but die once, and besides, the princess will have to speak some day, you know." So they went on again, past skulls and dead men's bones in all degrees of bleached whiteness. And by they reached another village where they deemed to rest for a little while, so that their wits might be so fresh and bright for the task that lay before them. But this time, though the people were kind and friendly, their faces were gloomy, and every now and then woeful cries would rend the air. "Oh, my brother, have I lost you? Oh, my son, shall I see you no more?" And then, as the prince's companion asked the meaning of the laments, which indeed was plain enough, the answer was given. "Ah, you also have come here to die. This town belongs to the father of the princess, and when any rash man seeks to move the princess to speak, he must first obtain leave of the sultan. If that is granted, he is then led to the presence of the princess. What happens afterwards, perhaps the sight of these bones may help you guess." The young man bowed his head in token of thanks, and stood thoughtful for a short time. Then, turning to the Lala, he said, "Well, our destiny will soon be decided. Meanwhile, we will find out all we can, and do nothing rashly." For 2 or 3 days they wandered about bazaars, keeping their eyes and ears open, when one morning they met a man carrying a nightingale in a cage. The bird was singing so joyously that the prince stopped to listen, and at once offered to buy him from his owner. "Oh, why encumber yourself with such a useless thing?" cried the Lala in disgust. "Have you not enough to occupy your hands and mind without taking an extra burden?" But the prince, who liked having his own way, paid him no heed, and paying the high price asked by the man, he carried the bird back to the inn and hung him up in his chamber. That evening, as he was sitting alone trying to think of something that would make the princess talk, and failing altogether, the nightingale pecked open her cage door, which was lightened fastly by a stick, and perched on his shoulder, murmuring softly in his ear, "What makes you so sad, my prince?" The young man started. In his native country, birds did not talk, and like many people, he was always afraid of what he did not understand. But in a moment he felt ashamed of his folly, and explained that he had traveled for more than a year, over thousands of miles, to win the hand of the Sultan's daughter, and now that he had reached his goal, he could think of no plan to force her to speak. "Oh, do not trouble your head about that," replied the bird. "It is quite easy.
Go this evening to the women's apartments and take me with you. When you enter the princess's private chamber, hide me under the pedestal which supports a great golden candlestick. The princess herself will be wrapped so thickly in her 7 veils that she will see nothing, neither can hide her face or seen by anyone. Then inquire after her health, but you remain quite silent. Next you say that you are sorry to have disturbed her, and that you have a little talk to the pedestal of the candlestick. When you speak, I will answer.
The prince threw his mantle over the bird and started for the palace, where he begged an audience with the sultan. Hey, Willard. Thank you for lurking. Let's see. The prince threw his mantle over the bird and started for the palace, where he begged an audience for the sultan. This was soon granted him, and leaving the nightingale hidden by the mantle in a dark corner outside the door, he walked up to the throne on which his highness was sitting, and bowed low before him. "What is your request?" asked the sultan, looking closely at the young man, who was tall and handsome. When he heard the tale, he shook his head pityingly. "If you can make her speak, she shall be your wife," he answered. "But if not, did you mark the skull as it strewed the mountainside?" "Some day a man is bound to break the spell, O Sultan," replied the youth boldly, "and why should I not bleed as well as any other? At any rate, my word is pledged, and I cannot draw back now." "Well, go if you must," said the sultan, and he bade his attendants to lead the way to the chamber of the princess, but to allow the young man to enter alone. Catching up unseen his mantle and the cage as they passed into the dark corridor, for by this time night was coming on, the youth found himself standing in a room, bare except for a pile of silken cushions and one tall golden candlestick. His heart beat high as he looked at the cushions, and knew that, shrouded within those shining veils that covered them, lay the much longed-for princess. Then, fearful after the other eyes might be watching him, he hastily placed the nightingale under the open pedestal in which the candlestick was resting, and, turning again, he steadied his voice, and besought the princess to tell him of her well-being. Not even a movement of her hand did the princess show that she even heard the young man, who, of course, expected this, and went on to speak of his travels, of the strange countries he had passed through, and not a sound broke the silence. "I can see clearly that you are interested in none of these things," said he at last, "and as I have been forced to hold my peace for so many months, I feel now that I must really talk to somebody, so I shall go and address my conversation to the candlestick." And with that he crossed the room behind the princess and cried, "Oh, fairest of candlesticks, how are you?"
"Very well indeed, my lord," answered the nightingale, "but I wonder how many years have gone since anyone has spoken to me, and now that you have come, rest, I pray you, a while, and listen to my story."
"Willingly," replied the youth, curling himself up on the floor, and there was no cushion for him to sit on.
"Once upon a time," began the nightingale, "there lived a pasha whose daughter was the most beautiful maiden in the whole kingdom. Suitors she had in plenty, but she was not easy to please, and at length there was only 3 whom she felt could even think of marrying. Not knowing which of these 3 she liked best, she took up counsel with her father, who summoned the young men into his presence, and then told them that they must each of them learn some trade. Whichever of them proved the cleverest at the end of 6 months should become the husband of the princess. Though the 3 suitors have been secretly disappointed, they could not help feeling that this test was quite fair, and left the palace together. Talking as they went on the handicrafts they might set themselves to follow. The day was hot, and when they reached the spring that gushed over the side of the mountain, they stopped to drink and rest, and one of them said, 'It will be best that we should each seek our fortunes alone, so let us put our rings under the stone and go our separate ways. And the first one who returns here can take his ring, and the others will take theirs. Thus we shall know whether we have all fulfilled the commands of the Pasha, or if some accident has befallen us." "Good," replied the other two, and the 3 rings were placed in a little hole and carefully covered again by the stone. Then they parted, and for 6 months they knew not of each other, till one day Then they parted, and for 6 months they knew not of what came of each other until the day appointed approached, and they met at the spring. Very glad they all were, and eagerly they talked of all they had done, and how time they had spent. "I think I shall win the princess," said the eldest with a laugh, "for it was not anybody that was able to accomplish a whole year's journey in an hour." "That is very clever, certainly," answered his friend, "but if you are to govern a kingdom, it may be still more useful to have the power of seeing what has happened at a distance, and that I have learnt," replied the second. "No, no, my dear comrades," cried the third, "your trades are all very well, but when the Pasha hears that I can bring back the dead to life, he will know which of us 3 will be his soon son-in-law. But, there are only a few hours from the 6 months he granted us. It is time we only hasten back to the palace." "Stop a moment," said the second. "It would be well to know what is going on in the palace." And plucking some small leaves from a tree under him, he muttered some words and made some signs, and laid them on his eyes. In an instant he turned pale and uttered a cry. "What is it? What is it?" exclaimed the others, and with shaking a voice he gasped, "The princess is lying on her bed, and has barely a few minutes to live. Oh, can no one save her?" "I can," answered the third, taking a small box from his turban. "This ointment can cure any illness, but how to reach her in time?" "Give it to me," said the first, and he wished himself to be the bedside of the princess, which was surrounded by the sultan and his weeping courtiers. Clearly there was not a second to lose, for the princess had grown unconscious, and her face was cold. Plunging his fingers into the ointment, he touched her eyes, mouth, and ears with the paste, with a beating heart, and waited the result. It was swifter than he supposed, and he looked the color came back to her cheeks, and she smiled up at her father, the sultan, almost speechless with joy at the sudden change, embraced his daughter tenderly, and then turned to the young man who owed her his life. "Are you not one of those I sent forth to learn a trade 6 months ago?" he asked, and the young man answered yes, and that the other 2 were even now on their way to the palace, so that the sultan might judge between them. At this point,
At this point in his story, the nightingale stopped and asked the prince which of the 3 he thought had the right to the princess. "The one who learned how to prepare the ointments," replied he.
"But if he had not been for the man who could see what was happening at the distance, he would have never known the princess was ill," said the nightingale. "I would give it to him."
And the strife between them waxed hot, till suddenly the listening princess started up from her cushions and cried,
"Oh, you fools! Can you not understand that if it had not been for him who had the power to reach the palace in time, the ointment would have been useless, for death would have claimed her, and if he and no other had ought to have the princess."
At the first sound of the princess's voice, a slave who was standing at the door ran at full speed to tell the sultan of the miracle which had taken place, and the delighted father hastened to the spot. By this time the princess perceived that she had fallen into a trap which had been cunningly laid for her, and would not utter another word. All she could be prevailed to do was to make signs to her father that the man who wished to be her husband must induce her to speak 3 times. And she smiled to herself beneath the 7 veils, as she thought that was an impossibility. When the sultan told the prince that he had thought he succeeded once, he would have twice to pass through the same test. The young man's face clouded over. It did not seem to him to be fair play, but he dared not object, and he only bowed low, and contrived to step close to the spot where the nightingale was hidden. It was now quite dark, and he tucked unseen the little cage under his cloak, and left the palace.
"Why are you so gloomy?"
asked the nightingale, as soon as they were safely outside.
"Everything was done exactly right. Of course the princess was angry with herself for having spoken. And did you see her? At her first words, the veils that covered her began to rend. Tell me..."
Yeah. This was what the nightingale was telling me.
Everything has gone exactly right. Of course the princess was very angry with herself for having spoken, and did you see that, at her first words, the veils that covered her began to rend? Take me back tomorrow evening and place me on the pillar by the lattice. Fear nothing, you only have to trust me.
The next evening, towards sunset, the prince left the cage behind him, and with the bird in the folds of his garment, slipped into the palace, and made his way straight to the princess's apartments. He was at once admitted by slaves who guarded the door, and took care to pass near the window so that the nightingale hopped unseen to the top of the pillar. Then he turned and bowed low to the princess, and asked her several questions, but as before she answered nothing, and indeed gave no sign that she heard. After a few minutes the young man bowed again, and crossed over to the window, and said, "O pillar, it is no use speaking to the princess. She will not utter one word, but I must talk to somebody. I have come to you. Tell me, how have you been all this long while?"
I thank you,
replied the pillar.
I'm feeling very well. It is lucky for me that the princess is silenced, or else you would not have wanted to speak to me. To reward you, I will relate to you an interesting tale that I overheard lately, about which I should love your opinions.
"Oh, that is charming," answered the prince. "So, pray, begin at once."
Once upon a time,
said the nightingale,
there lived a woman who was so beautiful that every man who saw her fell in love with her. But she was very hard to please and refused to wed any of them, though she managed to keep friends with all. Years passed away in this manner, with almost no one noticing them, and one by one the young men grew tired of waiting and sought out wives that would have been less handsome, but were also less proud, and at length only 3 of her former wooers remained, Bochi, Jakshi, and Farchi. Still she beheld them apart, though she still she held herself apart, though herself better and lovelier than other women, when on a certain evening her eyes were opened to the last of the truth. She was sitting before her mirror, combing her curls, when almost her raven locks she found of long white hair. At this dreadful sight her heart gave a jump, and she stood still. Am I growing old? She said to herself. And if I do not choose a husband soon, I shall never get one. I know that either of those men would gladly marry to me tomorrow, but I cannot decide between them. I must invent some way to find out which of them is the best, and lose no time about it. So instead of going to sleep, she thought all night long on different plans, and in the morning she arose and dressed herself. That will have to do, she murmured to herself as she pulled out a white hair which had cost her so much trouble. It is not very good, but I can think of nothing better, and well, they are none of them clever, and I dare say they will easily fall into this trap. Then she called her slave and bade her to let Jakshi know that she would be ready to receive him in an hour's time. After that she went to the garden and dug a grave under a tree, by which she laid the white shroud. Jakshi was delighted to get the gracious message, and putting on the used garments he hastened to the lady's house, but great was his dismay at finding her stretched on her cushions, weeping bitterly. "Oh, what is the matter, O fair one?" he asked, bowing low before her. "A terrible thing has happened," she said, her voice choked with sobs. "My father died 2 nights ago, and I buried him in the garden. But now I find that he was a wizard and was not dead at all, for his grave is empty and he is wandering about somewhere in the world." "That is evil news indeed," answered Jakshi. "But can I do nothing to comfort you?" "There is one thing you can do," replied she. "That is to wrap yourself in the shroud and lay yourself in the grave. If he should not return after 3 hours have elapsed, he will have lost his power over me, and forced to go and wander elsewhere." Now Jakshi was proud of the trust reposed in him, and wrapping himself in the shroud, stretched himself at full length on the grave. After some time Bochi arrived in his turn, and found the lady groaning and lamenting. She told him that her father had been a wizard, and that in that case it was very likely should wish to leave the grave and come work her evil. Bochi was to take a stone and be heavy, and be ready to crush his head if he showed signs of moving.
Dang.
Bulgy, enchanted at being able to learn his lady's service, picked up a stone and seated himself by the side of the grave wherein lay Judgy. Meanwhile, the hour arrived in which Firechi was accustomed to pay his respects, and in case of the other two, he discovered the lady overcome with grief. To him she said that the wizard who was enemy of her father's had shown a dead man out of his grave and had taken his place. But, she added, if you can bring the wizard into my presence, all his power will go from him. If not, then I am lost. Ah, lady, what is there that I would not do for you? Cried Francis, and running down to the grave, he seized the astonished Jagshi by the waist, and flinging the body over his shoulder, he hastened with him to the house. But the first moment Badger was so surprised by this turn of affairs, for which the lady had not prepared him, that he sat still and did nothing. But by and by he sprang up and hurled the stone after the two flying figures, hoping that he might kill them both. Fortunately, it touched neither, and soon all three were in the presence of the lady. Then Jagshi, thinking he had relieved her from the power of her wizard, slid off the back of Farji and threw the shroud from him. Tell me, my prince,
said the nightingale, when he had finished his story,
which of the three men deserved to win the lady? I myself would choose Farji.
No, no, answered the prince, who understood the wink the bird had given him. It was Bodji who took the most trouble. It was certainly he who deserved the lady. But the nightingale would not agree, and they began to quarrel. Still, a third voice broke in. How can you talk such nonsense? Cried the princess. As she spoke, the sound of tearing was heard. Why, you have never even thought of Jagshi, who lays in 3 hours in the grave with a stone held over his head. Of course he would be the one the lady would choose. It was not many minutes before the news reached the Sultan, and even now he would not consent to the marriage till his daughter had spoken a third time. On hearing this, the young man took counsel with the nightingale best how to accomplish this, and the bird told him that, as the princess, in her fury having fallen into the snare laid for her, had ordered the pillar to be broken into pieces, he must be hidden in the folds of the curtain that hung by the door. The following evening the prince entered the palace and walked boldly up to the princess's apartment. As he entered, the nightingale flew from under his arm and perched itself on top of the door, where he was certainly concealed by the folds of the dark curtain. The young man talked as usual to the princess without obtaining a single word in reply, and at length he left her lying under a heap of shining veils, now rent into many places. He crossed the room towards the door, from which came a voice that gladly answered him. For a while the two talked together, and then the nightingale asked if the prince was fond of stories, as he had lately heard one that interested him, and perplexed him greatly. In reply, the prince begged that he might hear it at once, and without further delay. And the nightingale began.
Once upon a time, a carpenter, a tailor, and a student set out together to see the world. After wandering for some months, they grew tired of traveling, and resolved to stay and rest in a small town that took their fancy. So they hired a little house and looked about for work to do, returning at sunset to smoke their pipes and talk of the events of the day. One night in the middle of summer, it was hotter than usual, and the carpenter found himself unable to sleep. Instead of tossing about on his cushions, making himself uncomfortable than he already was, the man wisely got up and drank some coffee and lit his long pipe. Suddenly his eye fell upon some pieces of wood in the corner, and being very clever with his fingers, had soon set up a perfect statue of a girl about 14 years old. This so pleased and quieted him that he grew quite drowsy and fell back to sleep. But the carpenter was not the only person who lay awake that night. Thunder was in the air, and the tailor became so restless that he thought he would go downstairs and cool his feet in the little fountain outside the garden door. To reach the door, he had to pass through the room where the carpenter had sat and smoked, and against the wall he beheld standing a beautiful girl. He stood speechless for an instant before a vintage touched her hand, when, to his amazement, he found that she was fashioned out of wood. "Ah, I can make you more beautiful still," he said, and fetching from a shelf a roll of yellow silk which he had bought the day before from a merchant, he cut it and draped it and stitched till a lovely robe clothed the slender figure. When this was finished, the restlessness had departed from him, and he went back to bed. As dawn approached, the student rose and prepared to go to the mosque with the first ray of sunlight. But when he saw the maiden standing there, he fell to his knees and lifted his hands in ecstasy. "Oh, thou art fairer than evening air, and clad in the beauty of 10,000 stars," he murmured to himself. "Surely a form so rare was never meant to be without a soul." And forthwith he prayed with all his might that the life should be breathed into it. And his prayer was heard. The beautiful statue became a living girl, and the three men all fell in love with her, and each desired to have her to wife. "Now," said the Nightingale, "to which of them did the maiden really belong? It seemed to me that the carpenter had the best right to her."
"Oh, but the student would never have thought of praying that she would have been given a soul had the tailor not drawn attention to her loveliness by the robe that she put upon her," answered the prince, who guessed that he was expected to say. As soon as they were quite in a petty quarrel, suddenly the princess, furious that neither of them alluded to the part played by the student, quite forgot how her vow of silence.
"Idiots that you are! How could she belong to anyone but the student? If it had not been for him, that all the others' work would have gone for nothing. Of course it was he who married the maiden."
And as she spoke, the 7 veils fell from her. As she stood up, the fairest princess that the world has ever seen.
"You have won me,"
she said, smiling, holding out her hand to the prince. And so they were married. And after the wedding feast was over, they sent for the old woman whose picture the prince had broken so long ago, and she dwelt in the palace and became the nurse of their children, and lived happily until she died.
Ow! I can't believe I did that whole freaking story in this voice.
Oh. So endeth the All Fairy Book. Now we gotta find someone to read. Oh. I'm glad I don't have to read for another few days. That was a lot. I'm thinking of fairy tales. Excuse me. Oh, man. There seems to be a maned wolf playing a story about fairy tale characters. So, I hope you all have a wonderful night. And I will possibly see you Monday when I'm playing playing Baldur's Gate with crowd control, because crowd control is fun. Good night, everyone.
In the hollow of the night, shadows weave and twist. The wolf has told his stories, wrapped in mystic mist, lurking in the silence where the echoes softly play. The echoes of forgotten tales, dimming as they sway. The hours drip like candle wax, slowly melting gold. Lands of frost and twilight, secrets yet untold. The forest breathes a shiver, its ancient heartbeats thrum. Underneath the silver glow, the wild whispers come. Time to close the book. shall heed the twilight.